In the heart of the night in Salem, laughter pierces the silence, but there's no joy in it. Lights flicker, and the town square, once brimming with celebrations, is overrun by colorful figures emerging from the shadows. They wear clown masks, and a macabre gleam shines in their eyes. People begin to vanish. Ethan desperately searches for his daughter, only to discover that each step drags him deeper into a nightmare where the victims aren't just chosen, they're judged. Halloween night in Salem was always a spectacle. Jack-o'-lanterns lit up the cobblestone streets, and the air was filled with the sweet aroma of caramel apples and cinnamon. Ethan watched the festivities with skepticism as the costumed crowd swirled around him in a whirlwind of laughter and music. He'd never believed in superstitions or legends. To him, Salem was just a town exploiting its dark history to attract tourists. But tonight, something felt different. The laughter sounded strange, out of place, like an echo from somewhere he couldn't pinpoint. Amy, his 16-year-old daughter, had begged to be part of an outdoor theater performance in the town square. Her group was reenacting one of Salem's most infamous witchcraft stories, blending old legends with a modern twist. Ethan was proud of her, but also uneasy. There was a tension in the air, something he couldn't name. When Amy disappeared backstage, he stayed rooted in place, watching. As the flickering lights seemed heavier than usual, as if weighed down by the very atmosphere, the show began. It was a mix of drama and comedy, with exaggerated characters that delighted the crowd. But during the third act, something unexpected happened. Among the actors, a figure appeared who didn't belong to the performance. A clown in vintage, colorful clothing and a grotesque smile. At first, the audience thought it was part of the act. Ethan, however, felt a chill crawl up his spine. The clown's presence felt wrong, as if it were out of sync with time and space. Amy, playing a young woman accused of witchcraft, seemed uneasy with the strange figure. She continued her performance, but her gaze frequently met the clown's, a mix of confusion and fear in her eyes. The final scene was meant to be a dramatic confrontation, but the clown stepped forward, crossing the stage silently. The audience fell silent too. The lead actor hesitated, glancing toward the directors at the back, but no one seemed to know what to do. Suddenly, the stage lights went out. A deep, distorted laugh echoed through the square. The crowd clapped, thinking it was part of the performance. But Ethan shot to his feet instinctively. When the lights came back on, Amy was no longer on stage. He ran to the backstage area, but she wasn't there. The other actors looked dazed, as if they couldn't remember the last few minutes. Panic set in as Ethan called out Amy's name, frantically pushing aside costumes and props, only to find nothing. The audience began to disperse, some murmuring about how intense the play's ending had been. No one seemed worried. No one seemed to realize that something had gone horribly wrong. Amid the confusion, Ethan saw something on the sidewalk. A small clown mask made of old fabric, smeared with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His trembling hands picked it up, the metallic, nauseating smell filling his nose. Inside the mask, something was stitched. A short, grotesque message. "Let's play, Ethan." He rushed to the local police station, where he was met with skepticism. The sheriff, an older man with a graying mustache, shook his head as Ethan recounted the events. "It's Halloween, sir. People drink, pull pranks. Your daughter probably went off with her friends." But Ethan knew Amy wasn't like that. And that message, how did the clown know his name? Dismissed by the authorities, Ethan resolved to act on his own. He returned to the now deserted square, which was cloaked in an eerie mist. The streetlights seemed dimmer, and the silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. Driven by a mix of instinct and desperation, he followed a faint trail, though he wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. His steps led him to a narrow alley where he heard a distant sound, the jingling of bells, followed by muffled laughter. The alley ended at a red door, old and peeling, which seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. He hesitated, but the sight of a blue ribbon, Amy's ribbon tied to the handle, pushed him past his fear. He opened the door and stepped into a dark, damp hallway where the walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. At the end of the corridor, Ethan found a small, abandoned theater. The stage was bathed in a pale, greenish light, and figures moved in the shadows. They were clowns, dozens of them, motionless, staring at him with vacant expressions. In the center of the stage, he saw Amy. She was sitting in a chair, her eyes wide with terror, her lips grotesquely sewn shut with black thread. Before he could run to her, the figures began to move, their footsteps echoing like metal on metal. They formed a circle around Ethan, their sinister smiles stretching impossibly wide, sharp teeth gleaming beneath their makeup. A deep, guttural voice filled the room. "Welcome, Ethan. Now, let's see if you, too, will be judged." Ethan felt his blood run cold as the clowns moved around him, their synchronized steps like a macabre dance. His eyes locked on Amy, sitting at the center of the stage. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to scream, but the grotesque black thread sewn into her lips silenced her. Ethan stepped forward, desperate to reach her, but the moment he moved, one of the clowns blocked his path, placing a cold, rigid hand on his shoulder. "You can't touch her." "Not yet," a deep voice growled, echoing through the empty theater. It wasn't any of the clowns speaking. The voice seemed to come from the walls, the shadows, and even from within Ethan's own mind. He turned to face the clown holding him, but its inhuman grin and lifeless eyes made him recoil instinctively. Fear gripped him, heavy and paralyzing, like chains wrapped around his chest. "What do you want?" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling and echoing in the stifling space. His question was met with laughter, not from one clown, but from all of them, their simultaneous cackles forming a deafening cacophony that made Ethan's ears ring. He fought to steady his breathing, but panic was rising inside him like a tidal wave, threatening to swallow him whole. Suddenly, the theater lights shifted, bathing everything in a deep red glow, as if the room were drenched in blood. The clowns around Ethan stopped laughing and began to move jerkily, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. One of them reached out, handing him a small, rusty key. "Prove your worth, Ethan," the voice said again, dripping with mockery. "Open the right door, or she suffers." Ethan's eyes darted around, and he noticed multiple doors lining the walls of the theater. Each one was identical, except for the numbers painted on them. His panic sharpened into a desperate resolve. Clutching the key tightly, he ran to the first door and tried it. The key wouldn't turn. Behind him, the clown's laughter erupted again, louder this time, mocking his failure. One of the lights above shattered, sending shards of glass raining down onto the stage. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized time was running out. He sprinted to the next door, fumbling with the key, but again it didn't fit. His heart pounded in his chest, and sweat dripped down his face as he approached a third door. But before he could try the key, a muffled scream echoed through the theater. He spun around to see Amy struggling in the chair, her head jerking as the threads on her lips tightened, pulling her mouth into a horrific grimace of pain. Ethan fell to his knees, unable to bear the sight. "Please, stop! Let her go!" he begged, his voice breaking. "Choose correctly, or lose everything," the voice replied, cold and unyielding. Ethan's eyes darted back to the remaining doors. Beneath each number was an engraving, symbols that looked like ancient runes. He didn't recognize most of them, but one symbol stood out. It was familiar, resembling a doodle Amy often drew in her notebooks. He ran to the door with the familiar rune, the key shaking in his hand. It slid perfectly into the lock, but before he could turn it, searing pain shot through his shoulder. He cried out and fell to the floor, catching a glimpse of a clown withdrawing a curved blade from his flesh. Blood poured from the wound as the clown tilted its head, grinning with sick amusement, before pulling the blade away in a slow, deliberate motion. Ethan clutched his shoulder, the warm blood soaking his fingers, but he forced himself to stand. Ignoring the pain, he twisted the key and flung the door open. Beyond it there was nothing, only a pitch-black void that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, pulling at him with an irresistible force. He hesitated for only a moment, then heard Amy's voice, faint and muffled, calling his name. Without thinking, he stepped into the darkness and fell. The impact was brutal, knocking the air from his lungs, but he realized he was still alive. Opening his eyes, he found himself in a completely different place, a dense forest, shrouded in mist. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Faint laughter echoed in the distance, and between the trees he caught glimpses of shapes moving. The clowns were there too, but they looked even more grotesque there, forms twisted and distorted by the shadows. Their movements were less human now, their limbs bending in unnatural ways. Ethan staggered to his feet, his shoulder still throbbing and slick with blood. He realized he wasn't in Salem anymore, or at least not the Salem he knew. This was a place where the rules of reality didn't apply, a nightmare realm where time and space seemed meaningless. As he stumbled forward, the sound of Amy's voice grew louder, closer. "Dad," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. But alongside her call came another voice, low and venomous, whispering directly into his ear. "You're beginning to understand, Ethan. The judgment has only just begun." Ethan walked through the forest with his heart pounding, the sound of the clown's laughter surrounding him like a twisted symphony. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull him under. The trees around him were grotesquely twisted, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the air. Amy's voice called out to him again, but there was something wrong with it, a distortion, an unnatural echo that made every word feel disjointed and distant. "Amy!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. She responded, but the sound came from every direction at once, bouncing through the misty forest. Ethan spun around, disoriented, desperately trying to find the source, but all he saw were shadows shifting between the trees. He pushed forward, even as fear and exhaustion clawed at him, his legs heavy and unsteady. The clown's laughter drilled into his mind, each peal like a jagged knife reminding him of how little control he had. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tensed. Slowly, he turned to see one of the clowns emerge from the fog. This one was different, taller than the others, its makeup smudged and its eyes completely black like endless voids. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, the skin of its face taut and on the verge of tearing. Ethan stumbled back, tripping, over a root and fell hard onto the damp ground. The clown advanced, looming over him with stiff, jerky movements like a puppet on invisible strings. Before Ethan could react, the clown spoke, its voice a horrifying mix of laughter, screams, and distorted whispers. "You thought you could face them, Ethan. You don't even understand what they are." It raised a hand, pointing to something. Behind him, Ethan turned his head and saw a clearing bathed in faint, sickly green light. At its center was a circle of ancient stones, etched with strange symbols. In the middle of the circle stood Amy, but she wasn't alone. 4 clowns surrounded her, each holding a rope that bound her wrists and ankles. They moved around her, in a grotesque dance, their laughter echoing like a demonic choir. Pain seared through Ethan's injured shoulder as he struggled to his feet. He ran toward the clearing, but the tall clown grabbed his arm with inhuman strength, stopping him in his tracks. "You cannot interrupt the judgment, Ethan," it hissed, its voice almost calm but dripping with malice. "This is how it ends. It always ends this way." With a primal scream, Ethan yanked himself free. Ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, he sprinted into the circle of stones, but the moment he crossed the boundary, the world around him changed again. The forest disappeared, replaced by a dark room with walls made of shattered mirrors. Each fragment reflected distorted images of himself and of Amy. At the center of the room stood a wooden table. On it lay an ancient book, its leather cover pulsating faintly as if it were alive. Beside the book was a clown mask, identical to the one Ethan had found back in the square. His breath caught as Amy's voice echoed again. "Daddy, help me." Ethan approached the table cautiously, his hands trembling. He knew the book was the key, but the moment he touched it, a jolt of pain ripped through his body, leaving him gasping for air. The book's pages opened on their own, revealing symbols and words written in a language he couldn't comprehend. The mirrors around him flickered, and Ethan saw figures moving within them. The clowns were there, watching him. One stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass, its twisted grin seeming to grow wider. It tapped the mirror as if trying to break through. "Read Ethan," the guttural voice commanded, echoing in the room, "or she will be ours forever." Ethan stared at the incomprehensible text, panic rising as Amy's screams filled the air again, louder and more desperate than before. He slammed his fists against the table in frustration until a realization struck him. The symbols in the book matched the ones he had seen carved into the stones in the clearing. He didn't need to read them. He needed to recreate them. Using the blood dripping from his shoulder wound, Ethan began to trace the symbols on the floor. Every line he drew sapped his strength, but he pushed on, driven by desperation. The clown's laughter grew louder, surrounding him, and the air itself felt oppressive, crushing his chest. As he finished the final symbol, a brilliant light erupted in the room, blinding him. The clown's laughter turned to agonized screams, their voices blending into a single deafening roar. When the light faded, Ethan found himself back in the clearing. Amy was lying on the ground, unconscious but breathing. He dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her in his arms. The clowns were gone, but the oppressive weight of their presence lingered. Relief washed over Ethan, but it was short-lived. A familiar voice, deep and menacing, echoed through the Clearing, closer than ever. This was only the beginning, Ethan. The true judgment is yet to come. Ethan carried Amy out of the circle, but her weight felt like more than he could bear. Each step through the forest was like trudging against an invisible current. The fog around him grew denser, and the laughter that had once echoed in his ears had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a suffocating shroud. Amy began to stir, her lips parting as she let out faint, garbled moans, but her words were incomprehensible, as though something unseen was keeping her from speaking clearly. "Amy, it's me. You're safe now," Ethan whispered, though even he didn't believe the words. The air was heavy, saturated with the feeling of unseen eyes watching his every move. He followed what he hoped was the way out, guided only by instinct, but every tree and shadow seemed to twist and lean toward him as if alive, as if the forest itself wanted to devour them both. Doubts clawed at his mind. Had they truly escaped, or was this just another cruel game orchestrated by the clowns? When he finally reached what appeared to be a road, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in his chest. But as he looked around, his heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. The streetlights were bent at odd angles, their bulbs flickering with unnatural hues of red and green. Rusted cars lined the roadside, their windows shattered and their frames abandoned to decay. This was Salem, but not the Salem he knew. He carefully laid Amy in the back seat of one of the derelict cars and shook her gently. "Wake up, Amy, please," he pleaded. Her eyes fluttered open, but the gaze that met his wasn't the same. Her stare seemed distant, as if she were peering past him into something he couldn't see. "They're still here," she murmured. Her voice dry and cracked. Ethan's chest tightened as panic began to take hold again. He climbed into the front seat and tried to start the car, but the key in the ignition was snapped in half, rendering it useless. Frustrated and desperate, he stepped out and hoisted Amy back into his arms. The eerie silence of the world around them was broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on the cracked pavement. Then faintly, he heard it, a low, rhythmic sound. It grew steadily louder, unmistakable now. Circus music, distorted and warped, playing from somewhere deep in the fog. Ethan froze and turned back, his eyes widening as a figure emerged from the haze. It was one of the clowns, but this one was even more grotesque. Its head tilted at impossible angles, its oversized hands contorted and unnatural. In one hand it held a balloon, not the kind of balloon you'd find at a party, but one that throbbed and pulsed as if alive. "Ethan," the guttural voice boomed, no longer distant but emanating directly from the figure. "You cannot escape the judgment. You opened the doors and brought this upon yourself. Now pay the price." Ethan clutched Amy tighter and began to run, his feet pounding against the pavement. But no matter how far he ran, every step seemed to loop him back to the same spot. When he turned to look over his shoulder, the clown was closer, its blackened eyes fixed on him. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. The clown stopped in its tracks, cocking its head to one side as if scrutinizing him. "Because you are guilty too," it replied, each word striking him like a hammer. "She isn't the only one bearing the sins of Salem. The blood is on your hands." Ethan stumbled, falling to his knees, but he refused to let go of Amy. "I don't know what you're talking about," he screamed, his voice raw and broken. The clown let out a laugh that cut through him like shards of glass. "You know," it hissed, Suddenly, flashes erupted in Ethan's mind, fragments of memories that weren't his, or at least not ones he remembered. Scenes of judgment, of screaming faces, of roaring flames. These weren't the Salem witch trials he had read about. They were something far more intimate. And then he saw it, his own face, twisted in righteous fury, standing among the accusers. "No," he whispered, shaking his head violently. The pain in his skull was unbearable, the images pounding against his mind like a drum. In his arms, Amy began to writhe, her small body contorting unnaturally. Her eyes opened again, but now they were pitch black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light. "Daddy, they're in me," she whispered, her voice fragile and laced with terror. Ethan felt her weight increase, as if she were being pulled from his grasp by some invisible force, but he held on tighter, his knuckles white. "You're not taking her," he roared. The circus music swelled to a deafening volume, and from the mist, more clowns began to appear, each one more monstrous than the last. They surrounded him, moving in a perfect circle. Each clown wore a mask, its design more grotesque and horrifying than the one before. And then, in the center of the circle, the tall clown emerged, holding the pulsing balloon like a sinister prize. "You can save her, Ethan," the clown said, extending the balloon toward him, "but only if you trade your soul for hers." Ethan looked down at Amy, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Daddy, don't." But he knew there was no other way. He rose to his feet, his legs unsteady, but his resolve firm. Holding Amy close, he walked toward the clown, every step feeling like it drained what little strength he had left. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. "I'll do it for her." The clown's twisted grin widened as it extended the balloon. When Ethan touched it, a blinding light erupted, consuming everything. He felt his consciousness begin to unravel, his very essence being torn apart. The last sound he heard was Amy's laughter. But it wasn't her. It was something darker, something that would haunt him for eternity. When Ethan opened his eyes, the world around him felt wrong, blurry, unfocused, like a dream teetering on the edge of a nightmare. He lay on a cold, featureless floor in a space with no visible walls or boundaries. Distant echoes of clown laughter floated through the air, fragmented and warped, as if pulled from an old, decaying recording. He tried to get up, but a weight pressed firmly against his chest, as though something was holding him down. Looking down, his breath caught in his throat. In his trembling hand was the clown mask, the same one he had cast aside earlier in his journey, but now it was alive, pulsating like a fragile, beating heart. Panicked, Ethan flung it across the room, watching as it hit the floor with a sickening thud. Yet the moment it landed, the same guttural voice from before reverberated. Around him, "You made your choice, Ethan. Welcome to the other side." Ethan staggered to his feet, his body aching and his mind swirling with confusion. In the distance, a faint light beckoned him, its glow cutting through the oppressive darkness. He stumbled toward it, his voice breaking as he called out for Amy. The sound echoed endlessly in the void, but there was no response. Doubt clawed at his heart. Was Amy truly safe? The clown had promised to free her, but at what cost? Deep down, Ethan knew something was terribly wrong. The faint light led him to a narrow corridor with walls lined by fractured mirrors. As he stepped forward, he caught glimpses of his reflection in the jagged shards and froze. The person staring back at him wasn't him. Each reflection showed a distorted version of himself wearing a clown mask, the painted grin mocking him as if savoring his despair. Worse still, the eyes behind the masks were filled with agony, silently pleading for release. Ethan turned his gaze away, refusing to look, but the corridor seemed endless, every step dragging him deeper into the haunting space. At last, he reached the end. Before him stood a massive black door, its surface carved with the same ominous symbols he had drawn in blood back in the forest. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, but he knew there was no other way forward. With a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed it open. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing a place he recognized immediately. Salem's town square, but it was twisted, distorted, a grotesque shadow of the town he knew. The once festive jack-o'-lanterns that had lined the streets were now decayed and rotting, their carved faces twisted into malevolent sneers. The houses were dark, their shattered windows glaring like hollow, watchful eyes. An unnatural chill crept through the air, and Ethan shivered as he stepped into the square. In the center, he saw her, Amy. She stood motionless, dressed in a white gown stained with blood. Her face was pale, her expression void of emotion. "Amy!" Ethan called, his voice cracking as he ran toward her. Relief surged through him, but as he drew closer, she raised a trembling hand, halting him in his tracks. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice cold and distant, devoid of the warmth he once knew. "Amy, it's me, it's over. You're safe now," Ethan pleaded, his hands outstretched. But she took a step back, her empty eyes locked on his. As she moved, glowing symbols appeared across her skin, the same markings from the stones in the forest. "They let me go," she said, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "But now I belong to them." Ethan felt his heart shatter. He had fought so hard, sacrificed everything to save her. But now he realized she was lost in another way entirely. Around them, the shadows began to shift. The clowns returned, stepping into the dim light. Their movements deliberate and slow. Their laughter was gone, replaced by grim, silent stares. The tall clown emerged from the crowd, its hulking figure towering over the others. "You broke the cycle, Ethan," the guttural voice boomed. "But there's always a price. She is ours now, as are you." Despair consumed him. Ethan screamed, lunging at the shadows, swinging his fists wildly, but it was futile. The clowns were intangible, slipping through his fingers like smoke. Amy stood still, her glowing eyes fixed on him as her tears fell. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with regret. Then before his eyes, she dissolved into the mist, her form vanishing alongside the clowns. The fog thickened and swirled around Ethan until he was alone in the square. Silence blanketed the air, heavy and suffocating. He fell to his knees, shaking, as his mind reeled from the loss. But something was different now. His hands felt strange, wrong. He raised them slowly and froze in horror. His skin was painted white, the texture greasy and thick like clown makeup. His fingers trembled as he touched his face, feeling the same cold, unnatural texture. A shard of broken glass nearby caught his eye, and he crawled to it, desperate to see. The reflection that stared back at him was not his own. It was the painted, grinning face of a clown. His face. The mask was no longer separate. It had become him. The guttural voice returned, this time inside his own head, louder and more menacing than ever. "Welcome to the show, Ethan. You are part of it now." Ethan dropped the shard, his breath shallow, as he collapsed onto the cobblestone. Around him, the square's lights began to flicker and die, one by one, until only darkness remained. Salem was quiet again, but Ethan knew the nightmare was far from over. The judgment had only just begun. Ethan walked through the deserted streets of Salem, now shrouded in an oppressive silence. The weight of the mask on his face felt suffocating, as though it had fused to his skin. He clawed at it, desperate to remove the grotesque thing, but it was useless. It wasn't just on him, it was part of him now. Every shattered window he passed reflected the same nightmare, a clown's face, white and painted, with empty, hollow eyes. His eyes, "Amy!" he shouted into the empty streets, his voice raw and desperate, but only silence answered him. The town looked like a corpse, a hollowed-out shell of the place he once knew. Storefronts stood vacant, their doors hanging open, like gaping mouths. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting unnatural shadows. All the while he felt eyes on him, an unseen presence that made his skin crawl. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, distant murmurs. But they grew louder, more insistent. "Ethan, you failed," they chanted over and over, the words wrapping around him like chains. "You failed. You failed." He froze as he felt a presence behind him, cold and menacing. Slowly he turned, and his breath caught in his throat. A shadowy figure loomed there, tall and grotesquely misshapen. Its painted clown grin stretched unnaturally wide, but its eyes, its horribly human eyes, were what froze him in place. "You can't run, Ethan," the figure said, its voice a low, mocking growl. "What do you want from me?" Ethan screamed, his voice echoing down the empty streets. The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and accompanied by the sickening sound of cracking bones. "It's not about what we want," it replied, its grin widening. "It's about what you deserve." Ethan's stomach turned as the truth began to claw its way into his mind. The judgment wasn't just about Amy, it was about him. Driven by raw, primal fear, Ethan turned and ran. The streets stretched endlessly, twisting into a labyrinth that offered no escape. Every turn brought him back to the center of town, to the place he wanted most to avoid. The circle of stones, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. In the middle of the circle, something new awaited him. A large, ornate mirror stood on a gilded frame, its surface pristine despite the decay around it. Strange inscriptions ran along its edges, symbols he couldn't read but somehow understood were meant for him. Ethan approached cautiously, his breath shallow, and looked into the glass. The reflection shattered his soul. The mirror didn't just show him, it showed his life. Moments of joy with Amy flashed by, beautiful but fleeting, followed by the dark shadow of his failures. He saw every time he had chosen work over her, every promise he had broken, every moment he had let her down. "You were never really there for her," the voice from the shadow said, now coming from the mirror itself. "No!" Ethan screamed, slamming his fists against the glass. "That's not true. I tried. I tried." His voice faltered, breaking into a whisper. Tears streamed down his face as he fell to his knees. "I just wanted to save her." The mirror did not shatter under his blows. Instead, it seemed to grow brighter, forcing him to confront his reflection, his sins, his failures. Around him, the clowns began to appear, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. They moved in unison, forming a circle as they swayed. in a slow, hypnotic dance. "You still don't understand, Ethan," the tall figure said, stepping into the circle. "This was never about saving Amy. This was about accepting who you are." Ethan looked down at his hands, trembling and pale. The clown paint now covered them completely, his gloves torn and dirty. His breath quickened as the realization dawned on him. He wasn't human anymore. He was one of them. The laughter started, not from the clowns, but from within him. It bubbled up uncontrollably, a deep, sinister sound that made him clutch his head in agony. He tried to fight it, but the laughter only grew louder, echoing inside his skull. Then the memories came, not just his own, but memories that didn't belong to him, faces of others who had stood in this same circle before him. He saw their fear, their struggles, their transformations. They had all been judged, all been condemned, all been turned into the very thing he now was. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The tall figure stepped forward, holding the mask Ethan had first found in the square. It held it out like an offering, though Ethan knew it was anything but. "This is who you are now," it said, its voice dripping with finality. It pressed the mask onto Ethan's face, sealing his transformation. Ethan tried to resist, tried to scream, but his body betrayed him. The mask fit perfectly, merging with his skin until it became inseparable. And then, for the first time, he felt something unexpected: acceptance. The transformation complete, Ethan rose to his feet. He was no longer himself. The other clowns parted, making way for him as he stepped into the center of the circle. In the mirror, he saw his new form: white face paint, darkened eyes, a sinister grin. Behind him stood the other clowns, their reflections overlapping with his. He was one of them now, another link in the endless chain of Salem's cursed story. As Ethan stared into the mirror, he understood the horrifying truth. The cycle would never end. He was a part of it now, just as all the others had been before him. The clowns' laughter filled the air, echoing through the empty streets of Salem. Ethan stood silently in the center, his grin frozen in place as the lights of the square began to flicker and fade one by one, and when the last light went out, only darkness remained. Months had passed since that fateful night, or at least that's what it felt like. For Ethan, time had lost all meaning. He was one of the clowns now, a shadow of his former self, wandering the streets of Salem with no purpose, no direction. Every night he reappeared in the town square, watching tourists celebrate Halloween, laughing and dressing up, blissfully unaware of the horror lurking in the shadows. He didn't speak or interact with the other clowns. A tiny fragment of his humanity still clung to him, setting him apart, but he could feel it slipping away with each passing day. The guttural voice echoed in his mind, relentless and insidious. "You are one of them now, Ethan. Accept your nature." One particularly cold night, Ethan saw something that made him pause. Among the crowd of costumed revelers, a young girl walked past him. She had brown hair tied back with a blue ribbon, the same ribbon Amy used to wear. His chest tightened, and he began to follow her, every step a battle against unseen forces. The mask fused to his face felt heavier, suffocating, but he pressed on. The girl turned down a dark, empty street, and Ethan called out, but his voice came out distorted, warped like an echo from another world. She stopped and turned to face. him, and for a fleeting moment he saw Amy's face staring back at him. "Amy," he cried, his voice trembling with desperate hope. But when he blinked, she was gone. In her place stood a group of laughing tourists, oblivious to his presence. Ethan dropped to his knees, the hollow ache inside him growing unbearable. He began to realize the truth he had been denying. The Amy he knew was truly gone. Perhaps she had been freed from Salem, but at the cost of his own sanity. He would never know. He was now bound to this cursed place, a prisoner of its dark legacy, unable to leave or reclaim what he had lost. As Ethan wandered aimlessly through the streets, he began to notice strange changes. Some of the tourists stared at him too long, their eyes lingering as if they could sense him, even if they couldn't see him. The shadows around Salem seemed to grow darker, deeper, creeping into every corner of the town. One night, from a safe distance, Ethan watched the town square. A new figure entered the circle of stones, a young man, confused and afraid, just as Ethan had been on that fateful night. The other clowns emerged from the darkness, encircling him with eerie precision. Ethan's heart sank as he realized the cycle was beginning again. He tried to shout to warn the boy, but his voice was weak, drowned out by the rising laughter of the clowns. The boy was taken, and Ethan could do nothing but watch. It was then that the truth crystallized in his mind. Salem was a trap, a timeless prison where past and present collided, and ancient judgments replayed in endless loops. He hadn't been the first to fall, and he wouldn't be the last. But deep, inside him, a flicker of resistance remained. Ethan began searching for answers, scouring the darkest corners of Salem for anything that could break the cycle. One night, he stumbled upon an old, forgotten library, its shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. Among the crumbling books, he found a diary. Its pages were filled with the accounts of others who had suffered the same fate, each one detailing their descent into the same darkness. One sentence stood out: "The only way to break the cycle is to destroy its anchor, but the cost is greater than anyone can bear." Ethan didn't fully understand, but he knew it would require a sacrifice, one he was willing to make. He couldn't save himself, but maybe he could save others. Maybe he could end the nightmare for good. On Halloween night, Ethan returned to the circle of stones. This time he wasn't afraid. He waited until the next chosen victim stepped into the circle. When the clowns began to surround them, Ethan broke rank, stepping forward and disrupting their ritual. The green light that emanated from the stones flared brighter, and the guttural voice roared with fury. "What are you doing, Ethan?" it demanded. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes locked onto the mirror at the center of the circle, the same mirror that had shown him his life, his failures. With all the strength he had left, he ripped the mask from his face and hurled it at the mirror. The impact shattered the glass, sending shards flying in all directions. The green light vanished, plunging the square into darkness. For a moment there was only silence, as if time itself had stopped. When the light returned, Ethan was gone. The circle of stones was empty, and the clowns had disappeared. The oppressive weight that had hung over Salem was lifted. The town felt lighter, as though freed from an invisible curse. Far away, Amy woke from a dream. In it, she had seen her father smiling at her, his face free of the mask, waving to her from somewhere far away. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew in her heart that he had done something extraordinary. Salem remained a popular tourist destination, but the air of dread that had once permeated the town was gone. The Circle of Stones became just another historical curiosity, its dark history forgotten by all but a few. Ethan had given everything to break the cycle, to ensure that no one else would endure the same fate. In doing so, he had found a way to set Salem and Amy free. If the nightmare has truly ended, or if the circle still lurks in silence, waiting for its next victim, well, that's the question we'll leave for you to ponder. Stories like this have the power to confront us with our deepest fears and sacrifices. What would you do if you were in Ethan's place? How far would you go to save someone you love, even if it meant losing yourself in the process? If this story captivated you and left your mind spinning, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did Ethan find redemption, or is the cycle something that not even the greatest sacrifice can break? For more stories full of suspense, mystery, and mind-bending twists, subscribe now to Sinister Smiles. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of the darkness that's yet to come. Remember, true horror isn't just what happens around you, it's what awakens inside you. Darkness never disappears completely. It always finds a way to return, and when it does, you won't want to face it alone.